And it's a great pleasure to welcome Michael Emery this evening for a second session on coaching for safety. Michael, I've attended a course for you up in Edinburgh 2 or 3 years ago. Really enjoyed that course, and I'm really looking forward to the second part of that journey. And over to yourself, Michael.
Thank you very much, Ashley. And before I go any further, congratulations, Chris. I'm absolutely sure that it's very well deserved, and it's nice to see you again. So I'd like to thank, well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with you on such an evening. And I'd like to thank the members of the branch committee, Ashley and Helen and Amanda and others, I'm sure, for pulling this together and making it happen. I'm very grateful. By way of introduction, and if you've heard this before, then apologies. I am a safety practitioner myself, first and foremost. I have been since 1988. Since 2012, I've been a qualified executive coach, and I've been promoting coaching skills to safety professionals since about 2013 through the Coaching for Safety program. In recent times, I've been developing ideas around how coaching skills and techniques, which are normally associated with one-to-one conversations, can actually be utilized and deployed at a macro level, if you like, to influence culture. And so that's really the basis of this evening's presentation. So if I can share my screen, and I'm hoping that you can all see that and put it onto slideshow. So this presentation is really an extension of the previous presentation I've done on coaching skills, and this is about culture building, and it's using some of those coaching skills and techniques at a macro level. And what I'd like to discuss with you this evening are, first of all, some initial thoughts on culture, because I see culture in a particular way which may differ to how others see culture. I'd like to talk about being solutions focused and what being solutions focused actually means in a coaching sense. And this is important in this presentation because our approach to culture change is an approach based upon being solutions focused. So I need to say a few words about that. And then what I'd like to do is I'd like to just outline one of the implementations that we have going on at the moment. So it's a real life case study. It's a real organization, albeit I've given them a fictitious name for the purposes of this presentation, but it's a real life organization, a real life experience, which would just give you an idea about how some of the things that I'll be introducing you to actually play out in reality. And then I'd like to wrap up by just talking about Thrive and the stages of Thrive. Thrive is our culture building initiative, and I'd just like to sort of wrap up the session by outlining the key steps in Thrive. So first of all, what is culture? So it seems a strange question to ask, but I think it's an important question to ask. Now, in recent times, the phrase, the way we do things around here, seems to have been adopted in many circles as a kind of common way of describing the culture of an organization. So I'd like you to just think about that for a short while, and to think about how accurate you think it is as a way of describing culture, and how helpful you think it is when it comes to culture change. So the way we do things around here suggests, doesn't it, that there's a way of doing things that people in the organization all agree with and they all support. And it suggests that there's a kind of a way of doing things which is common across the organization. I would just like you to reflect on that and think about what your experiences are. Because our experiences are that that cultures are a bit more complicated than that. And I think most of us will acknowledge that we've had experience that, you know, cultures can vary across an organization. So in an organization, whatever the size, culture might be different from one site to the next, or on a particular site, culture can differ from one team to the next. And it wouldn't be too outrageous to suggest that culture could change in a particular team. Their culture could change from one time to another. So cultures are not necessarily fixed, and they can differ and they can vary. So I think the way that I've come to think about things is this. I'd just like to pose you a question. So if I was to ask you the question, how would you characterize the culture in Victorian England? So what would you say? How would you describe the culture in Victorian England? What would you say? So if we were to ask for opinions, you know, I'm sure these are the sorts of things that people would say about the culture in Victorian England. They'd probably say something like, you know, Victorians were ruled by, you know, a detailed manual of manners and etiquette, that they prized reputation above many other things. They'd say that the lives of Victorian children were very formal. You know, Victorians believed that children should be seen and not heard, and they'd say that the lives of Victorian children often lacked outward expressions of emotion. So those are the kind of things that you'd hear people say describing Victorian culture. Now, that may very well have been true, and it may very well have been increasingly true over the course of Queen Victoria's reign. But it was never universally true, of course. I mean, we know that from the novels of Charles Dickens. I mean, Charles Dickens virtually, you know, chronicled Victorian times in fiction form. And we may have got glimpses of those things that I've just mentioned when we have the opportunity to look into the drawing rooms of the middle classes, say. But think about, you know, those colourful characters that are mentioned in Charles Dickens' novels. Many of them were far from being like that way I've described. So whilst it might have been true, and it might have been increasingly true over the course of the era, it wasn't universally true. And of course, those things weren't only true of the Victorian era. You know, there were people with those standards before Queen Victoria came to the throne. And there are people with those standards around today. So it wasn't universally true, and it wasn't only true of that era. But the thing is, it became true enough, often enough, that it defined the era. So we see culture as being the prevailing demeanor and attitude of a group of people. And rather than expecting that we're ever going to get a culture which is common across an organization, what we should actually be aiming for is to be getting the kind of culture that we want present more often in more groups of people for more of the time. That should be our goal, because culture is a complicated thing. So that phrase, the way we do things around here, we feel isn't really that accurate when it comes to describing culture, and it really isn't that helpful when it comes to understanding culture change. Now, the second thing to say about this phrase is that it seems to allude, doesn't it, to, you know, the way we do things, meaning practices and meaning procedures. But that's not how people think about culture. You know, if you go down to your nearest town, wherever your nearest town is, and you stop 100 people in the streets and you ask them to define or describe the culture in their organization, they're more than likely going to say something like, well, it's a very collaborative culture, or it's a very supportive culture, or it's very authoritarian. So when people are using phrases like that, they're not really thinking about the things that we do in that organization. What they're thinking about is they're thinking about the prevailing kind of environment in which they work. Now, this might seem like splitting hairs, it might seem like semantics, but actually it's quite important, because the definition that we accept influences the decisions that we make. And if we accept a definition which is focused mainly on practices and procedures, then it's no wonder, is it, that when companies come to want to change their culture, they'll often subscribe to a new way of doing things. So, you know, for example, a behavioral safety implementation. Many companies opt for a behavioral safety implementation, believing that if they have that, it will provide a positive influence on their culture. But I'd just ask you this question. I mean, do you believe that implementing a behavioral safety approach is going to have a positive influence on the culture? Or do you believe that you actually need the right culture as a prerequisite for getting a successful behavioral safety implementation? I believe the latter is true. I think that if you're going to be considering behavioral safety at all, you'd better be sure that you've got the right culture, a culture that's going to support that kind of approach and withstand that kind of approach and make it work. And of course, we know that, you know, whilst there are successful behavioral safety implementations, many of them are not successful. So again, the way we do things around here just isn't really that accurate when describing culture, and it's not really that helpful when it comes to understanding how to change culture. So we see culture as the prevailing demeanor and attitude of a group of people. And just like, you know, when you talk about a prevailing wind is a wind that blows from a direction which is most usual, but sometimes it blows from another direction. Then the same also can be said of culture. You know, there's a prevailing culture which might differ from place to place and occasionally from time to time. So that's how we've come to see culture. Now, we use a solutions-focused approach to culture change. So I think I need to say one or two things about being solutions-focused. Now, most people would like to think that they're solutions-focused. And what most people think solutions-focused means is it means that, oh, Michael's really solutions-focused. You know, he's a really good problem solver, and he's got an eye for sort of like imaginative and you know, special kinds of solutions. So he comes up with really imaginative solutions. To a lot of people, that's what solutions focused means, being a good problem solver and being able to come up with good imaginative solutions. But in the coaching world, that's not what solutions focused means at all. In the coaching world, being solutions focused means using solutions-focused techniques which avoid a detailed analysis of a problem and instead seek to learn as much as possible about the solution. So if you were to Google being solutions-focused, you would come across this lady, Insu Kim Berg. Now she was, I think she's passed away now. I think she was a Korean American therapist who developed a solutions focused approach to therapy. And as with much in coaching, you know, we've borrowed this thinking from therapy. That's where it originated. So the solutions-focused approach uses a technique called the miracle question. So again, if you come across in Zuckerberg, you'll come across the miracle question. And the miracle question is designed to avoid a detailed analysis of the problem. And it's almost as if the problem doesn't exist, and instead seeks to learn as much as possible about the solution. Because if we can define the solution in very clear terms, then there's a chance that we can see examples of that solution, however small they are, however fleeting they are, already existing, that we can then develop. So in coaching terms, we call those resources. So there are examples of what we want. There are small examples maybe, and they might only be very fleeting when they occur, but they're dormant resources, because if we can understand why they occur when they do, then we can replicate those circumstances in other areas of the organization and breathe life into those resources so that they gradually spread across the organization. So when it comes to culture, it's quite possible that you have the culture that you want already, but it's just not present enough, often enough, for it to be defining for you. But if you can find those examples of what you want, then you can develop them. They're dormant resources. So the way the miracle question works is basically this. If I were to give you the culture that you want, if I could work miracles, and just by clicking my fingers, I could give you the culture that you want, how would you know you had it? So if the magic worked overnight, tonight, while you were in bed, and you had the culture that you want when you arrived at work tomorrow morning, how would you know? What would be the first telltale signs? What would you see? What would be happening? What would people be doing? What would be different? Now, if we can define the culture that you want in these detailed terms, then there's a chance that we can see these resources, these examples of what you want that exist currently, albeit they're not present often enough for them to be defining. So that's a solutions-focused approach, because at no point are we trying to analyze the problem and sort of root cause the problem. We're being solutions-focused. But being solutions-focused also means understanding the fundamental foundations of a good culture and building upon the fundamental foundations of culture. So we believe that these are the fundamental foundations. So people need to feel safe. So however inherently hazardous an operation is, so you can think of inherently hazardous operations like, I don't know, construction maybe, or foundry work, or I don't know, agriculture, but something that's inherently hazardous, mining say. It doesn't matter how inherently hazardous the operation is, people need to be able to feel safe. And it's a bit unrealistic to start talking about culture if people feel unsafe, because in terms of a hierarchy of needs, that level of safety and security is a fundamental requirement. So people need to feel safe at work. We think that building a culture is easiest if people have something to get behind. Now, I've been reading recently about how Bill Shankly transformed Liverpool Football Club from a sort of lowly second division team to the giants of Europe as they became in the time that Bill Shankly was Liverpool manager. And people got behind Bill Shankly. And it was their ability to get behind this man that helped develop the culture that became the Liverpool way. It's not always a person, it's quite often a person. If you have a leader with a strong personality and people fall behind him, then that's going to lend itself to being able to develop this kind of culture that you want. And sometimes it's a product that people can get behind, sometimes it's a brand, but it's easier to build a culture if there is something that people can fall in behind. The way that people engage with each other is important, because what makes the difference for us in terms of how we perceive culture in our workplace, a lot of that is determined by how our immediate colleagues engage with us, particularly our immediate supervisors and our immediate managers. And if they're engaging with us positively, if they're engaging with us collaboratively, then that really helps us, like that culture, and it really lends itself to helping build the sort of culture that most organizations are after. So that ability to engage collaboratively is really important in our view. And then finally, people feeling aligned and focused. So you need, again, to align people behind a single goal and a single vision, because if people are pulling in different directions, then it's going to make the job of building the culture that you want all the more difficult. So being solutions focused also means recognizing these fundamental foundations of culture and building upon those foundations. So I'd like to talk to you now about one of our implementations, which is a real life organization. They're a food manufacturer in Greater Manchester. XYZ Limited is a fictitious name, but this is a real organization and this is a real experience for us. So XYZ Limited, from really a position of performing quite badly in health and safety terms, they've gradually improved their health and safety performance, so that last year in an audit, they really scored quite well in an audit that took place around November time. And shortly after that audit, Simon, the managing director, was talking about the results of the audit and his aspirations for XYZ Limited. And what he said was that he wanted to be brilliant. So me being the way I am, my coaching radar kind of pinged into life. And I said to Simon, okay, so what does being brilliant mean? And he was a bit surprised by that question, because he said, well, everybody knows what brilliant means. I want to be brilliant. And I said, no, in this context, what does be brilliant mean to you? If I were to click my fingers, if I could work miracles and I could give you brilliant, how would you know you had it? So from an informal conversation, this then led to a more formal meeting with the whole of the leadership team. And the leadership team, you know, facilitated by this solutions-focused technique, the miracle question, defined what being brilliant meant to them. And they came up with 6 critical indicators, which would indicate what being brilliant meant. And then the leadership team decided that they needed to know how brilliant they were currently. So they wanted to survey the workforce to find out how brilliant the workforce thought they were. So those 6 critical indicators, we turned those into questions and we wrote them down onto a survey questionnaire, and we questioned the whole workforce, 50 odd employees. And there was no pressure around this. You know, we said, you know, we're interested in your views. Fill out the questionnaire if you'd like to. There's no pressure if you'd rather not. Put your name on it. We'd like to have a chat with you afterwards. If you don't want to put your name on it, that's fine. There was absolutely no pressure. And the deadline was set for survey papers to be returned just before the Christmas break. And we were pleased that the majority of employees did return the papers. And we were pleased that the majority of those people did put their name on the papers. And we put a simple scoring mechanism behind it. So the questionnaire was based upon these 6 criteria. And do you strongly disagree, neutral, agree, or strongly agree? And we put some scoring behind it. So Strongly disagree was -2, and strongly agree was +2, and then there was a range of scores between it. And so we put it all onto a spreadsheet, which crunched some numbers, and this is what we found. You know, so the culture score, if you like, how all the numbers crunched out, was 154, which doesn't really mean anything, but it's just an indicator. But more importantly, the survey was revealing in several respects. Firstly, it was revealing insofar as indicators 4 and 5 were concerned, because whilst we were far from brilliant on anything, we were clearly disastrous on indicators 4 and 5. So instead of trying to understand why we were so poor at indicators 4 and 5, which would have been a problem-solving approach, we completely ignored trying to analyze why we were poor on indicators 4 and 5. We just decided what we were going to do to be brilliant on indicators 4 and 5. And we came up with a number of key initiatives to become brilliant in indicators 4 and 5. So we then started to implement those initiatives. Now, another thing that came out of one of those initiatives to address indicator 5 is that we discovered some really key concerns that the workforce had around some hazards, one or two of which we were completely unaware of and taken by surprise. So we started to engage with people in order to become brilliant at indicator 5, and actually learn some things we just didn't know and weren't aware of. So that was a real sort of breakthrough in terms of this approach. What we found over the course of time was that some of the traditional key performance indicators that we'd never really been that good at started to improve. So particularly around near-miss reporting. We'd never been particularly good at near-miss reporting. But actually, as we were building brilliant, the number of near-miss reports went up. So that month after month, we were often getting, you know, the best level of near-miss reporting that we'd ever had, which was kind of an indirect benefit of this approach that we were taking. And we started to put some small group activities together to try and address these key health and safety concerns that had been flushed out by our initiatives. So a kind of new atmosphere started to develop. It was a kind of more collaborative atmosphere, and the team, the leadership team in particular, just seemed to gel together a lot more strongly. You know, they felt more comfortable being challenged. They could be challenged without feeling threatened, and they came to feel more comfortable with hearing suggestions without thinking that it was a judgment on them. So people would make suggestions, and previously, you know, they'd have taken that as some sort of a judgment on themselves. They weren't doing that anymore. So this new collaborative, team working sort of atmosphere began to develop in the place. So after 6 months of this gradual changing of the way the culture felt, we felt that we needed to resurvey. Now, we were a bit anxious about this because those critical health and safety concerns that the employees had made us aware of, we hadn't actually physically resolved any of those things. And we put some containment measures in place, but they were a bit sort of sticking plasterish. We hadn't actually fundamentally resolved them. So our expectations going into the next survey was, you know, we might, because of this burgeoning sort of culture and this feel good that we were all feeling, we might get a modest improvement in the culture score. But, you know, reality is we haven't fixed anything. So, you know, let's not be too unrealistic about what we're going to find. And what we did find when we resurveyed was that not only did more people respond to the survey, more people put their names on the survey, and the culture score went up an amazing amount, 70 odd % to 268. Now it's only a number. There's nothing really that objective about it. It's just an indication, but we were this blew our minds that really, without really fixing anything, these initiatives that we deployed with a view to becoming brilliant were being recognized by the workforce and acknowledged through this survey. So where we're at today in XYZ Limited is that we're continuing to be brilliant. And this is how our solutions focused approach to culture change has been deployed. You know, at no point have we root caused the problem. We've almost ignored the problem. We've never said to ourselves, why is it that we're so rubbish at indicators 4 and 5? We've just taken it as read that we are rubbish. And so we've implemented initiatives to become brilliant. So that's how it's played out, or is playing out at Be Brilliant at XYZ Limited, because the journey is far from over. So I'd just like to sort of wrap this presentation up by just outlining what I think are the key messages behind Thrive, which is this solutions-focused approach to influencing culture. You know, we think that you have to invest in coaching capacity because, I mean, if there are any gardeners out there, gardeners generally appreciate the role that worms play in a garden. So, you know, worms are really important in terms of fertilizing the soil, in terms of irrigating the soil and allowing for drainage. Worms are really important in gardening. I see coaches, although this isn't a very flattering term, I see coaches as the earthworms of culture change. Because if you've got coaches out there, they're real enablers that help that culture change to happen in a similar way that earthworms are so important in a gardening sense. So I believe that it's necessary to invest in your coaching capacity within your organization. You need to define what you want. You know, you need to be very clear. Now, you know, let me be clear. Culture change comes from within. And the role that I've played at XYZ Limited is the role of a coach. So I've facilitated the process, but none of the ideas have come from me. The ideas have come from the team. Culture change has to come from within. No consultant can give you the culture that you want. You know, they can help facilitate the process, but it has to come from within. So each organization, I believe, needs to define in very clear terms what it is they want in terms of the culture that they aspire to have. There's a need to identify those dormant resources. You know, however it is that you define your culture, most organizations are kind of after a similar-ish type of culture ultimately. However it is you define that culture, there's every chance that you will find these dormant resources, these examples of the culture that you want, however small they are, however fleeting. And if we can try and understand how it is that those dormant resources exist when they do, then we can replicate those circumstances elsewhere in the organization, and we can breathe life into those resources so that gradually they extend further and further throughout the organization, and we build the culture that we ultimately say we want. We feel that it's important to engage collaboratively with the team. So this really is important in terms of determining how each individual team member feels about the culture, because how they feel about their culture is pretty much determined by how people engage with them on a day-to-day basis. So engaging in the proper way, which is for me, engaging in a collaborative way, is really important. We believe that creating a sense of urgency, this isn't the sort of thing, if we really want to be brilliant, it's not really something that you can leave on the back burner and pick up every couple of months or a quarter or whatever, just when time seems to allow. You need to have a bit of urgency behind this. It needs to be prioritized. If you really want to be brilliant, you've got to go for it. So you've got to create a sense of urgency in I believe. You've continuously got to remind yourself of the goal. You've got to continuously remind yourself that you want to be brilliant and actually what that means. Because ultimately, you have to live the culture you say you want. If you say you want to be brilliant, then ultimately you have to be brilliant. So you have to behave according to those indicators that you've identified for yourself. So you don't get the culture that you want by behaving a different culture. You get the culture you want by behaving that culture, in this case, in being brilliant. So it's important to continuously remind yourself of what it is you want, what your goal is, what your vision is, and you have to live that culture. And you have to continuously review and ask yourself what's next. Because certainly what we've found in our implementations is that if things go quiet, then people think that you're no longer eager to achieve that goal. But sometimes things go quiet because there are things going on in the background. Well, you have to think, well, what next then? What next can we do to bring this to life again? Because if we allow it to go quiet for too long, then people will think it's all over when it's not. So there's a continuous need, I believe, to be reviewing and asking, well, what's next? What are we going to do next to engage with the team again around this vision of being brilliant? So that kind of wraps up this presentation for me. That wraps up what we think are the key stages in this solutions building approach to culture change. So I hope you've found that interesting. I hope you've enjoyed that. And if there's a Q&A session, then I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks ever so much, Michael. I really appreciate that. I think Amanda's got a couple of questions in the wings there. Are you there, Amanda?
I don't think she can do anything.
Oh. No, are you mutable? Hey,
I'm here, sorry. I couldn't unmute. I'm like, God, unmute. I'm with you now. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Michael. That was a really good presentation. Just a couple of follow-up questions. So first of all, how does a solutions-focused department interact with a SHE team that appears not to be? What kind of steps would you advise and recommend that they take?
Sorry, could you repeat that, Amanda? I'm not sure I understood the question.
Oh, sorry. So how does a solutions-focused department interact with a SHE team that appears not to be solutions-focused? How do you kind of balance that interaction?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure whether if you're reading the question right. So there's not a solutions-focused department. There's a solutions-focused approach.
No, sorry, a department that is solutions focused. So one department's solutions focused, and then is trying to liaise with the SHE team who isn't on the same page.
Well, I believe that occupational safety and health practitioners, IOSH practitioners, should be solutions focused. So, I've said that you need to, or I said that an organisation needs to invest in their coaching skills. That means investing in a solutions focused capacity. Now at XYZ Limited, I am their coaching capacity. I'm facilitating the process. I know about being solutions focused. You know, the SHE team for me need to have their sort of coaching capacity invested in to make them solutions focused, because I believe that IOSH practitioners should be solutions focused. I think this is a really important technique that IOSH practitioners should be able to deploy. So, you know, I would say this, wouldn't I? I know that's what people are thinking, but I think that IOSH practitioners should be solutions focused.
Okay, great, thank you. Paul's dropped a question in the chat to ask, how does the methodology compare to the alternative solution of fully understanding the problem before trying and arriving at a possible solution?
Right, so that's a great question. So in a normal problem solving approach, you know, you would use some sort of diagnostic. So, you know, people are used to sort of root cause analysis or 5 whys analysis to sort of study a problem and then try and identify the underlying causes and then the root causes. And the theory is, isn't it, that if you can address those root causes, then not only do you stop this happening again, you stop other similar things happening again, because they share the same kind of root causes. Now, that's all well and good when we're talking about accidents and near misses, although we do have experience, don't we, of how sticky it can become sometimes, because when you apply a 5 whys technique, you often go down avenues where you're having to discuss with people judgments that they've made and decisions that they've made, and, you know, discipline issues, etc. So our experience is that, you know, a 5 whys approach can become a bit sticky, even with something like trying to stop an accident happening again. It can become a bit sticky. Now, just imagine employing that approach when what you're trying to improve is the culture. You know, imagine trying to identify what the root causes are of a culture that we're not satisfied with. You know, it's a lot of it's going to do with human behavior. You know, our culture isn't great because he's doing that or she's not doing this. You know, I'm sure you can imagine that kind of approach is going to become pretty messy. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm a safety practitioner. I have been since 1988. If I'm investigating an accident, I'll use 5 whys technique. But I don't really want that kind of an approach when it comes to making a cultural journey, because it just seems all wrong to me, and it just seems as though it's just going to make life more difficult for yourself. Much better, much cleaner, in my view, is a solutions focused approach, which avoids that dissecting of the problem in a 5 whys sort of root causing kind of a way. It just, if you're used to dealing with a solutions focused approach, it is just so obvious. It's just so cleaner, so much cleaner.
Thank you. And just based on the back of that, you mentioned about keeping the urgency on the matter and making sure it kind of stays at the forefront of everybody's minds. And just comparing the 2 techniques that you've mentioned, do you think that there's, I don't necessarily want to say a faster approach to either of them, but do you think one of them is more timely maybe, or you'd expect to see even small changes quicker than the other solution?
Well, I don't think a problem-solving approach to culture change is going to work in any case. So I don't think there's a comparison to be made. I mean, in terms of timeliness, what do people say about culture change? They say it takes years. So it's not something that happens overnight. You know, it's quite extraordinary what we've experienced at XYZ Limited. You know, that indicator rising from 154 to 268 in such a short period of time is extraordinary. and you have to have concerns about how that's going to be sustained over a period of time. But you know, culture change isn't an easy thing. It takes time, and once you get to where you think you want to be, it needs to be maintained, because it's easy to fall back into old ways. So it's, you know, I don't think it's necessarily it's certainly not easy to compare one approach with another, or even one organization with another. You know, organizations are different sizes. They're different. Some are one site only, some are multiple sites. You know, they're very different, and they come from different starting points. So I think it's difficult to talk about time when it comes to culture change. I think you've just got to accept that it's going to take time, and you're probably always going to have to maintain it. You've always got to behave that culture if you want that culture to maintain. I mean, I hate to be a football bore, but if you go back to the Liverpool example, Bob Paisley had more success as a Liverpool manager than Bill Shankly did, because he sustained the culture that Bill Shankly built. Now, you know, forget about which teams I support. Compare that with Man United when Alex Ferguson left. You know, Man United fans won't be happy with the way that turned out. So, you know, there's a lot to be learned about culture from these examples. So you have to maintain a culture. If you get to where you're going, you want to go, well done, but it isn't over then. It needs to be maintained.
That's great. Thanks, Amanda, for doing those Q&As. First, thank you, Michael, for a really informative presentation. And thanks
welcome.
always to Helen, Peach and Molly in the background, and the IOSH Northwest and Manchester Branch Committee